My name is Natalie Mast. I am the program manager working on the management plans at ADWR. And this is a meeting of the 5th Management Plans Work Group, the Agricultural Subgroup. Thank you everybody for logging on, for being with us today. We know that this kind of format is not necessarily the preferred format for these kinds of conversations, but we're kind of doing our best to continue these conversations and make progress toward developing these management plans through this format. So we hope you'll bear with us and definitely provide us any feedback or ideas that you might have on our platform, on the methods we're using to conduct these meetings, that type of thing. We are still hoping that we can have a productive, collaborative process through this, even if it's sometimes a little more difficult through the online platform. So thank you for being here, and thank you for bearing with us through that. So I'm going to hand it over to McKenna for just one moment to run through some ground rules on how we are going to conduct this meeting. And then we'll go ahead and dive in. McKenna?
Thanks, Natalie. So if you've been to our previous meetings, we are following the same format. So if you would please remain muted throughout the meeting, that'll help us prevent any feedback or other audio issues. If you would like to speak, just type your name in the chat box and we will be calling on people in the order that they chatted their name. And I will let you know before I'm going to unmute you, and then you can go ahead and speak. And whenever you're done speaking, we can put you back on mute. And if you would prefer just to type your questions or comments in the chat, you can do that as well. And Maggie Martin will be reading those out in order as well whenever we take pauses for questions and comments. And lastly, this meeting is being recorded. And the chats, the messages that you put in the chat box to everyone, those will also be recorded.
Okay, great. Thank you, McKenna. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Welcome, everybody. Thank you again for being here. My name is Natalie Mast. I have a couple additional ADWR staff on the webinar today helping out with things. You just heard McKenna Welsh, who is helping run some of the kind of technical pieces of the webinar today, helping with muting and unmuting people. We have Maggie Martin, who is going to be helping with the chat box and reading off any comments if you would like to type your questions or comments into the chat box. And we also have Amanda Long Rodriguez, who is going to be helping. She's running the presentation today and is also going to be presenting some of our data throughout today's meeting. So we also have Teresa Johnson on the webinar today. If you have any technical issues, questions like that about the webinar specifically, you can feel free to message Teresa directly in the chat and she can help you there. So it's definitely a team effort getting these webinars put together. So thank you to everyone who is helping with that. So we'll go ahead and get started today. Amanda, if you could go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All right, so here's our agenda for the day. Some of this is going to be review. We'll be going over what our statutory framework for the agricultural conservation programs is, the definitions that we're working with, the statutes around that, and then we'll also be working through ADWR's analysis of the BASE and BMP program data, and really just laying out the whole sequence of that data analysis. We are making an effort here to respond to some of the questions and concerns that we've heard in previous meetings. So what we're going to do today is hold questions until the end of item number 3, just because we've sequenced this. We think we've answered a lot of the questions that might come up in the sequence of those first 2 parts of the meeting today. So we will take questions after item number 3 and at the end of the meeting. So please, as we've mentioned before, you can send your questions or ask to speak through the chat box. You'll notice that we do have slide numbers on all of our slides. I know they're a little bit small, they might be hard to see, but we're happy to go back to previous slides if we need to as well in the course of those question and comment periods. So you might want to note the slide number if you'd like us to flip back to a previous slide. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and dive in. So we're going to start today with some introduction into some of our key issues with management plans and the types of things that we are working toward for the 5th management plans. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Amanda. The management goals are our big picture. The management plans are a big part of the way that we work toward the management goals for each AMA. And it's a big tool that we have under the Groundwater Management Act in order to make that progress in each AMA. So the goals are slightly different in Pinal and in Santa Cruz. And each AMA is a little bit different and has its own unique things about it. But that's also why we have a management plan for each AMA. And that's something we'll get to as we get further into the sequence of these meetings. We'll want to talk about how we can customize for each AMA and for each goal. But overall, big picture, we're working towards these goals and we want to make progress. We want to use the management plans to make progress toward the goal of each AMA. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The statutes laid out general structures for the management plans. A series of 5 successive management plans for each active management area. These are iterative with increasing conservation, building upon each previous plan. So for agriculture specifically, we did have water duties starting with the first management plan. You can see that in that first highlighted line in this table. We started with water duties, and then under the 3rd management plan, we added in the best management practices, the historic cropping program, options for other alternatives, and some other tools that are options in our toolkit for moving toward the goals of each AMA. But ultimately, the purpose of all of these programs, all of these structures, is to reduce withdrawals of groundwater in order to move each AMA toward its goal. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So these are our key issues for the 5th management plans. We want to consider how we can find that progress, how we move toward each management goal in each AMA. And we need to be clear about the definitions that we're working under and the strategies and the tools that we have available. We'll also need to consider our timeline and how it is that we use the 5th management plans to move the AMAs into a drier future. If we could go to the next slide, please. So again, at a very basic level, this statute on the screen lays out the series of 5 management plans, but it also gives direction for those first 2 items that I just mentioned. Our basic strategy for moving each AMA toward its goal is to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. Our definition of conservation comes from the context in this statute. Conservation programs should be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. And so in the context of the management plans, our metric for conservation is reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. You've heard me say this a dozen times. I'm going to be saying it again. This is our guiding principle here is reducing withdrawals of groundwater. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So the timeline here is important as well. The conservation requirements in the 5th management plans, as well as the other management plans, will remain in effect until the new requirements take their place. So we don't currently have a 6th management plan or any other type of structure in place in statute. So while we certainly anticipate that something will come and take its place and will continue to build on this culture of conservation that has really been a beautiful thing about this state, we do know that the 5th management plans will remain in place until something comes in and takes its place and becomes effective. So we want to see these plans as an opportunity to transition us into a drier future, to transition us into that next stage of conservation for the AMAs. We want to build something that is flexible and reasonable, but also makes progress. It reduces withdrawals of groundwater in order to move us toward the goals as much as we can in the ways that we can, moving us toward the goal of each AMA. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So as we develop those plans and those strategies, we want to do so with an eye toward the historical data to ensure that we're meeting the requirements of the statutes and finding where we have room for improvement. We've been working through a lot of this in previous meetings, and we kind of want to lay out our progress and the analysis we've done here today. So if we could go to the next slide. There are currently, in the management plans, there are currently 3 conservation programs for agriculture. Most of the time we only talk about 2 of them, and the reason for that is there are not currently any participants in the historic cropping program. So again, today we're going to focus on the base program and the best management practices, or the BMP program, and run through some of the data and the different ways that we've looked through the data for these 2 programs. So if we could go to the next slide. So in the BMP program, or excuse me, in the base program, this data is for the base program. So what you can see on this slide here is so the chart on the left-hand side is the percent change in allotment over time. The chart on the right-hand side is the percent change in irrigation acres over time. You can see that the shapes of these kind of match each other, which is intuitive. As irrigation acres are retired, you're going to see those allotments going down as well. So the different lines are the different AMAs. So what you can see is really that some AMAs have very significantly reduced their irrigated acreage, and some AMAs that type of transition has been different. It's different economies, different structures. This is just showing those changes over time, and in some AMAs, those acres are being developed or converted to other uses. So what we see is a net reduction in those over time because of those grandfathered grandfathered rights putting a limit on that growth. So we see this transition in reductions over time for the total allotments and the total irrigated acres associated with agriculture. If we could move to the next slide, please. So when we talk about the agricultural BMP program, we do want to just point to the statute. We always reference back to the statute for the things that we're working with in the management plans. The statute for the Ag BMP program indicates that instead of complying with an irrigation water duty or a total allotment, that a farm would do BMPs, but that the program should be designed to achieve conservation that is at least equivalent to that required under the base program. So that's kind of the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today is how do we analyze that equivalency? Again, when we're talking about conservation in the context of the management plans, we're talking about reductions and withdrawals of groundwater. So we're going to be looking at this a lot of different ways. We are going to try to answer a number of those questions that have come up in previous meetings, but we're really going to start at the beginning and kind of go through the whole sequence of how we've analyzed this data. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it off to Amanda, and she's going to walk us through a lot of that data analysis.
Hi, good afternoon. So we've looked at this data for the base and BMP programs in several different ways, and I'm going to run through that analysis here for you today. So this first section is what we presented at the previous data meeting in November. It shows the average acre feet per irrigation acre for the base and BMP program farms in the Phoenix and Pinal AMAs, the two AMAs which have farms participating in both programs, as well as the AMAs together. This chart shows that on average, the acre foot per acre is higher in the BMP program than the base program. The weakness of this chart being that it only uses the legally irrigable acres to calculate the average acre foot per acre, meaning that these numbers do not include, or sorry, these numbers include the acres that may have been fallowed or idle in each year. And ADWR does not have reported information on those acres that are fallowed, but I will try to get to what we've done to address this weakness a little later on in the presentation. So one way we analyze these programs is according to these charts. This shows the combined total water use and allotments for the base and BMP programs over time. The base program includes all of the AMAs. The BMP program just includes the Pinal and Phoenix AMAs, as those are the only two AMAs participating in the BMP program. The gray line shows the sum of all the irrigation acres, and the orange line shows the sum of all the allotments. Although we know that the BMP program farms are not subject to an allotment, but their allotment is still calculated as if they were in the BMP program for comparison. The blue line shows the cumulative water use over time. This blue line reflects the total water used as reported in the AMA annual reports over time. This includes the use of all types of water and flex credits. The data also shows only those rights that report water use, so zero-use farms are not included in this data. So we can break this out and look at the individual programs. So this one here is for the base program. This graph shows the same information as above, but just for the base program. So the blue line again represents the total water use, including all water types and flex credits. The orange line represents the sum of all allotments, and the gray line, the irrigation acres over time. So for the base program, what we can see is on an aggregate, the base program farms are using or coming close to using their full allotment over time. Whereas in the BMP program, it shows the opposite. The use and allotment lines are inverted compared to the base program. Again, this graph shows the same information as the previous two graphs, but with only data for the BMP program. The farms in this program are on aggregate using more water, that blue line there, than they would be allotted to use, which is the orange line, if they were in the base program, and you can see that that gap is growing over time. So looking at all three graphs there together, we can see that the BMP program is increasing overall use as compared to the base program over time. So looking at the data in this way, it does not appear that these two programs are achieving equivalent conservation. We wanted to consider some additional suggestions and information, so we did another analysis comparing the base and BMP programs. So this addresses that weakness I discussed earlier, and it is that the analysis includes the fallowed acres, and fallowed acres is not something that ADWR has reported data for. However, the USDA has an interactive online tool called CropScape that displays the cropland data layer. It was created to provide the Agricultural Statistics Board with estimates of major commodities and crop-specific digital products. The cropland data layer is created using remote sensing, and it provides georeferenced information on crop-specific land cover data. And it uses this technology to predict what crops are being produced in a specific area. It has been created for the continental US annually since 2008, and this cropland data includes information on those acres that are fallowed or idle. I use this fallowed cropland data for Arizona from 2008 to 2018 to calculate the number of fallowed acres in each IGFR in each year from 2008 to 2018. Once I had that number of fallowed acres calculated, I then, for each IGFR, subtracted the fallowed acres from the corresponding irrigation acres to get the actively irrigated acres in each IGFR in each year. So using that new information, I recreated that slide that we talked about a little bit earlier. So instead of using irrigation acres here, this graph uses the actively irrigated acres from each program in the Phoenix, Pinal, and all AMAs. So here you can see that the average acre feet per actively irrigated acre is still higher in the BMP program as compared to the base program. This is true for the Pinal AMA, the Phoenix AMA, and then all AMAs as a whole. Another way we can look at this acre feet per acre information is to compare both the acre foot per irrigation acres and the acre feet per actively irrigated acres as a whole instead of looking at averages. So I did this in the next couple of graphs for the Phoenix and Pinal AMAs. So the first couple of graphs shows the percent of farms in each program type by the number of acre feet per irrigation acres from 2008 to 2018. So this is the acre feet per acre, including acres that have been fallowed. The left graph shows the results for the Pinal AMA, and the right graph shows the results for the Phoenix AMA. The horizontal axis in both graphs shows the number of acre feet per irrigation acres, and the vertical axis for both graphs shows the percent of farms of each program type. So you can see for both graphs, the proportion of BMP program farms, or these gold bars, skews to the right, here and here. And the proportion of base program farms, or the green bars, kind of skews to the left. This shows that there are a higher proportion of farms with a higher acre feet per irrigation acres in the BMP program, and a higher proportion of farms in the lower acre feet per irrigation acres in the base farms. As an example, the base program farms peaks at 3 to 4 acre feet per irrigation acres, 3 to 4 over here for both Phoenix and Pinal AMA. And the BMP programs peak in Pinal at 4 to 5 acre feet per irrigation acres, and then 6 to 7 acre feet per irrigation acres. So both higher in the BMP program versus the base program. We also looked at the same information, but removing the fallowed acres using that USDA cropland data layer. So looking only at the actively irrigated acres for both the Pinal and Phoenix AMAs from 2008 to 2018. Again, this shows the proportion of each program type on the vertical axis and the number of actively irrigated acres on the horizontal axis. Pinal again is shown on the left and Phoenix on the right. The results here actually look really quite similar to the ones before, with the proportion of BMP farms, or the yellow bars, again skewing to the right, here and here, and the proportion of the base farms skewing to the left, and those are those green bars here. The results do differ a little bit compared to the previous graphs, but just only ever so slightly. The peak for the base program is still around 3 to 4 acre feet per actively irrigated acres in both the AMAs. However, that 4 to 5 acre feet per irrigation acre increases for both AMAs, almost to the same level here for Phoenix, those green bars there. The peak for the BMP program is still 4 to 5 for the Pinal AMA, and then 6 to 7 for the Phoenix AMA. So a higher proportion of farms in the higher acre feet per acre in the BMP programs versus the base programs. So we can see from this analysis that the base and BMP programs do not appear to be achieving equivalent conservation. So another way that we looked at this data, and this was a question that was asked at the last work group meeting, was to look at the use by program by water type, or specifically for groundwater. We did this again by looking at the Pinal and Phoenix AMAs, since they are the two AMAs that participate in both programs. This first slide shows the groundwater use in the Pinal AMA in the base and BMP programs from 2003 to 2018. This graph on the left shows the total groundwater use by program type over time, and the graphs on the right show the groundwater use in the Pinal AMA split up by the base program here on top and the BMP program here on the bottom. And you'll notice that these three graphs don't have the same scale here on the vertical axis, and that's done intentionally so that we can more clearly see what's happening with groundwater use over time. So we can see that the groundwater use in the base program seems to be flat, or ever maybe so slightly decreasing over time, while the BMP program shows an increase of groundwater use over time. And increases in the BMP farm's groundwater use has outpaced any decreases from the base program. So this change is not from switching programs, it's an actual expansion of groundwater use. So we did the same thing in this next slide for the Phoenix AMA. So this shows the base and BMP program over time from 2003 to 2018 for the Phoenix AMA. The graph on the left again shows the total groundwater use by program type over time. And the graph on the right shows the groundwater use split up by program type over time, with the base program on top and the BMP program below. Here, the base program groundwater use is over time kind of flat, maybe slightly increasing there at the end, whereas the groundwater use is shown to be increasing over time. So the increase in groundwater use, again, is not a result of a switch in the two programs. And an increase in the BMP program groundwater use does not correlate with a decrease in the base program groundwater use. And we are also not seeing a correlating increases in renewable sources of water. So by looking at just groundwater use, we can again see that the two programs do not appear to be achieving equivalent conservation. So with that, I will pass it back to Natalie before we take questions.
Okay. Thank you, Amanda. So the statute indicates that the BMP program, as I said before, the BMP program should be designed to achieve conservation that is at least equivalent to that required under the base program. So we've looked at this a lot of different ways. We've looked at it from a lot of different angles, filtering things out, trying different types of analyses. And all of those analyses are pointing in the same direction. So every way we have looked at this data, it tells the same story. The BMP program is not currently achieving conservation at least equivalent to the base program. So we will be looking for ways that we can adjust the program, adjust the design of the BMP program to bring it closer to equivalency under the 5th management plans. ADWR suggested a strategy at a previous meeting. We're going to come back to that discussion of those strategies at future meetings, and other options that we have for agricultural conservation programs. We'll come back to that discussion starting at the July 20th meeting, our next meeting of this subgroup. So we know we've covered a lot of information here. I know there were some questions coming in the chat box. So we'll pause at this point to take some of those questions. Again, as I said before, we'd be happy to go back to previous slides if that would be helpful. And as McKenna said at the beginning of the meeting, you can either type your question into the chat box, or you can just ask to be unmuted and speak using that chat box, and we'll call on people kind of in the order that things come in. So with that, Maggie, do we have any questions?
Thank you, Natalie. We do. I have a comment here from Kathy. She has mentioned, I agree with transitioning to a drier future, but also transition to a warmer future. That has water implications such as increased evaporation and increased ET. We have an additional question here. I believe this question is in reference to slide 23. Melinda has commented, does your data take into account farms that moved from the base program into the BMP program, or was that number constant?
And I think Amanda may have answered that question kind of in the course of explaining that slide. Amanda, can you chime in there? She's still muted.
Oh, sorry. So it does, sorry, I might be reading this question incorrectly.
So I think what my understanding of the question, at least, Amanda, I think you had it in your explanation for this slide, is that what we're seeing here is that this change is not associated with farms just moving from one program to the other, that this is a net increase in groundwater use. Did I say that correctly?
That sounds correct.
Maggie, did you?
Yes, we do have an additional question here from Brian. He has commented, did you figure in changes in water supply sources? Recent years, less surface water has been available, therefore groundwater goes up.
So when we were looking at, there were some previous slides that looked at total water use, and we see the same thing. I'm not remembering which slide number that was. Perhaps slide 18, yeah. Yeah, no matter if we're looking at just groundwater or whether we're looking at total water use, we kind of see the same pattern, that water use under the BMP program is increasing, is expanding as compared to the base program.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. I have an additional question here from Dave. He has commented, how much of the change in water use by farmers is due to changes in cropping patterns since the 1975 to 1979 base period?
That's a good question, and it's not necessarily something we have good data on. As many of you know, we don't currently require crop type to be reported, so it's not something we track. It could be an interesting thing to look at, but at this point, we're just looking at total water use associated with each program, at least partially because of that definition of conservation, which is reducing withdrawals of groundwater. So we're looking at the water use patterns, not necessarily the cropping patterns.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. I see here that Brian would like to speak. McKenna, can you unmute him, please?
Yes, Brian, I'm unmuting you right now.
Okay, since I'm a slow typer and it's easier to explain my question, I think, verbally, what's on the screen right now tells me, if I'm looking at this correctly, you have a flat and possibly slightly downward trend of the base in the base programs combined. So are you still viewing you're not achieving it if you're combining both together?
So
you guys hear that?
yes, yes. So what we're seeing, what our point of comparison here under the statute is that the BMP program should be achieving conservation equivalent to that achieved by the base program. At least equivalent, I should say. What we're seeing in the base program is a slightly downward trend in terms of the total water use, in terms of the total allotments, but that ratio of the allotments and the total water use shown on these charts, for the base program, it's always slightly under on the aggregate. Again, these are aggregated numbers. So on the aggregate, that use is pretty consistent, is not expanding as compared to one another.
Okay, follow.
Oh, wait,
if I can follow.
However, under the BMP program, what we are seeing is, yes, those kind of theoretical allotments are increasing, but the total water use is outpacing that increase. The total water use is expanding in excess of what those kind of the additions to that program would be.
If I could follow up, if I'm unmuted, I think I just have this inherent sense that notwithstanding the good work you've tried to do to analyze this on a bulk basis, I think we're missing some subtleties about the combinations of both programs together. And I think it's important as to understanding why a farmer goes to BMPs and what lands he brings in. And you're seeing a substantially less amount of water use in that bottom chart that's associated with BMPs as compared to the base programs. And I just have a sense that there's something missing, but I cannot put my finger on it. And when I look at that top chart, I see something flat. And, you know, is it appropriate? I understand the definition of what's supposed to happen with the BMPs, but if you're working in concert together with both programs and you're meeting a pretty good goal, you know, I'm just concerned about that.
Sure. And it's a fair question. However, I would maybe push back on, so the top item is flat, yes, but our direction under the statute's management plans is to reduce withdrawals of water, and that's not what we're seeing in the combination of the two programs. So where we're seeing the increases in groundwater, to kind of the later slide that we showed, is under the BMP program. So that's where we want to focus some of those efforts and see if we can bring that BMP program more in line with the base program so that we can have that downward trend in groundwater use in both programs and not just in the base program.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you're going to find in Pinal MA in particular, because of their unique water supply challenges and situations, you're going to see an increase in groundwater use just as a ratio to total water supply, even if total water usage was coming down. Okay. Oh, and just real quick, I'm assuming the groundwater includes in lieu water treated as groundwater?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Next questions, Maggie?
Yes, we do have a couple additional comments that have come through, one of which is from Dan. He has commented, to the extent that ADWR tries to collapse the BMP program into the water duty requirements in the base program, it likely would require growers to farm less acreage, which would eliminate most of the incentives for growers to participate in the BMP program. There are a lot of flex credits available. Have you considered whether making the BMP program too restrictive might induce growers to revert to the base program and use flex credits to keep more acreage in production, which could eliminate the gap you presently see between the base program and the BMP water usage?
It's an interesting question. Thank you for the question, Dan. Ultimately, so the numbers you see on the screen, the numbers that we showed in all of these charts, is that's total use. That includes any usage of flex credits. So even with existing usage of flex credits in the base program right now, the total water use in the base program does not, in most years, exceed the total allotments, which tells us that the flex credit utilization, at least right now, is not really exceeding the total allotments in any given year. Granted, you're absolutely right that that be something that could change. However, there's a lot of reasons that someone might choose to be in the base program or choose to be in the BMP program or choose to be in a theoretical additional program under the fifth management plan. What we're working with here is kind of our direction under the statute. Again, under the statute, we are directed to design the program to achieve conservation equivalent to that seen in the base program. That's not, we're not currently meeting that language of the statute. So what we're going to do with the BMP program is make it a little bit more restrictive and try to design it to come a little bit closer to equivalency. We're not instituting water duties in that program. That program specifically says that it's in lieu of assigned water duties or total allotments. But what we want to do on the aggregate is bring those two programs closer into alignment with each other.
Thank you, Natalie. I have a comment here from Stephanie. She's mentioned, it seems like you would have to consider changes from 50 years ago in crops water consumption if you are going to use total water consumption versus the base. Your assumptions are based on 50-year-old information.
Sure, and our crop data, yes, is out of date. But the water duties are a little bit separate. So the water duties are calculated based on what was grown between 1975 to 1979 and ET and a bunch of different things that go into that water duty calculation. However, what we're looking at here, we don't necessarily know because we don't require reporting on crop type. We don't necessarily know if that farm is still growing the same crops as they were during that time period. So what we're looking at here is just total water use on the aggregate across the AMA by program. We're not necessarily doing an analysis by crop or looking at changes in crop consumption for this type of analysis. Again, it's reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. It's just looking at the aggregate water use.
Thank you, Natalie. I have a comment here, or rather a question from Dave. What types of activities is ADWR thinking about for the BMP program to make it more restrictive?
Thank you, Dave. And maybe I was mirroring some of the language in one of the questions, and maybe restrictive wasn't the best word to use there, but I appreciate the question. And it's a good question. We don't have anything set at this point. That's something that we're going to have to get further into the discussion of in future meetings. Something ADWR brought to the table in a previous meeting is the idea of instituting some kind of tiers for the BMP program, maybe different number of points that you would need to achieve based on different criteria, but that's going to be something that we're going to need to develop. And that's something that we're really looking for feedback on. If people have ideas on what it is that we can do to bring these programs closer into alignment, we are looking for those types of ideas through this process. Thanks, Dave. Was there anything else, Mike?
No further questions or comments right now.
We'll a little bit further in the presentation. So if there's anything else that people think of as we work through the rest of the slides, we can certainly take those questions then. Thank you for really good questions. Those I think those are helpful to clarify and also helpful to reiterate where we're going, what we're trying to do here, what it is that we're looking at. As I said at the beginning, we are trying to make sure that what we're building here is reasonable. We're not trying to put anybody out of business. We're trying to work with the regulated community to find the conservation that we can in each sector, while also moving toward the goals of the AMA as a whole. It's two-sided, and we're really trying to find the ways that we can meet both of those requirements, reducing withdrawals of groundwater while also finding reasonable ways of moving forward in each AMA. So let's see here. So kind of moving into the next section of the presentation, we can go ahead and move to the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about our timeline, our path forward for the 5th management plans as we kind of move into the next portion of our meeting today. So as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be moving toward this program development phase of this work group. So we have talked a lot about data, and we certainly want this process to be data driven, but we also need to start talking about the details of these programs and how it is that we adjust the strategies we have and create new strategies in order to move into that drier future we talked about. Excuse me. So this timeline on the screen, for a lot of reasons, is tentative and rough. Our original plan was to use this calendar year to work through kind of the work group process, the development process for the 5th management plans. For a lot of reasons, we might need to extend that timeline a little bit, but we are still largely planning on using the bulk of 2021 to draft the 5th management plans, including that kind of customization piece for each AMA. And then to take 2022 to adopt those 5th management plans. Because of the 2-year lag between when plans are adopted and when they become effective, that means those conservation programs would become effective in 2025, on January 1st, 2025. So if we could move to the next slide, please. This subgroup is a part of this process. We're working toward the goals of the management plans work group in each of these subgroups. We, again, assessed our existing conservation programs, and we want to start updating those existing management strategies and also start having conversations about developing new management strategies. So we're working through all of this in these subgroups in order to develop kind of the framework for the 5th management plans as a whole. If we can move to the next slide, please. We've made a lot of progress in this subgroup. We've gone through a lot of information, a lot of background information and water use data and definitions and a lot of really hard conversations already. And we want to start having maybe even harder conversations about how it is that we adjust these strategies in response to all of the things that we've already discussed. So we had introduced this concept of tiers for the BMP program. Maybe there are other better ideas out there. We want to hear those ideas. We want this to be a collaborative process. We want to get feedback from you all, hear ideas from out there. So if there are other ideas out there and how we might bring those two programs better into alignment, please reach out. Please speak up. We would love to hear from you all if there are better ideas out there. Additionally, we had an idea that was sent to us about what we're calling an integrated farm program, which would allow kind of a combined reporting structure for farms. So that's something we're going to want to talk about more in future meetings. Again, this is kind of that piece of developing new management strategies. We are able under the statutes to create other alternative conservation programs. So this is a really interesting idea that provides a little bit of flexibility for the farms while also checking that box that I keep talking about of reducing withdrawals of groundwater. So we are looking for additional ideas like that, and we'll want to develop this idea more fully so that we can include it in the 5th management plans. Our next meeting is on July 20th at 1 p.m., I believe. So we hope that you'll all continue to participate in these meetings. We definitely appreciate all of the feedback and the ideas that we've received so far. So I'll go ahead and pause here. Do I have any additional questions? Are there any additional thoughts on kind of the whole process here?
Thank you, Natalie. I do have a question here from Melinda. She is wondering, if no one is doing the historic cropping program and it isn't being used, why is it still included in the plan?
That's a good question. So the historic cropping program and the BMP program are both programs that are listed in the statute as things that we shall include in the plan. So under the statutes, we are required to include that program in the management plan. The statutes on that particular program are pretty detailed on how it should be structured. So there's not really a lot of flexibility in different things that we could do with that program to make it more appealing or productive for people.
Thank you, Natalie. I have a comment here from Carol. I believe this is just sort of to everyone. She has mentioned we need to balance the supply-demand equation. How can we manage the demand side better? How can we improve the BMP program to achieve equivalency? What ideas can we come up with? This is a challenge in front of us. As Natalie says, we are looking for ideas.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Carol. Carol talked a lot about that idea of demand management in our last full work group meeting. It's a great thing to kind of circle back to. I appreciate her bringing us back to that. These are concepts that we're wanting to work with. We're wanting to think about the ways we think about these programs and think about how do we reduce our demand? How do we balance that supply and demand equation in order to reduce withdrawals of groundwater, in order to move toward the goals of the AMAs? It's all connected. Yeah, it can be complicated and confusing, but we're really working toward the aggregate goal of the AMA here. Thank you, Carol, for that reminder. Oh, and
I have an addition.
Go ahead, sorry.
I have an additional question here from Stephen. He has commented, are there ideas being considered for improving the BMP written down, and can they be accessed?
It's a very good question. So all of our meeting presentation slides and the recordings from previous meetings are on ADWR's website. You can access those on the Fifth Management Plans page on our website. It's new.azwater.gov/5MP. And you can access all of our previous meetings on there, all of the recordings, all of the slides. All of our meetings are also accessible through the public meetings calendar on our website. To answer Stephen's question a little bit more specifically, in our last ag meeting, we did talk about some of those ideas and some of the questions for how we might adjust the BMP program. All of this is very much in draft phase at this point, where we are in the idea phase. So it's not fully written down because those ideas aren't fully developed yet. And we're here early on asking for this feedback rather than bringing you a fully formed thing and saying, here it is. We want you all to be a part of the development of it and the part of that generation and idea formation of it as we're creating this into something that can be reducing withdrawals of groundwater, but also something that is functional for the regulated community. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Natalie. I don't see any other questions or comments right now.
All right, so we can go ahead and move to the next slide. I would like to just put in a little plug for our other subgroups. I know many of you participate in multiple meetings. Our next upcoming subgroup meeting is the municipal subgroup. We'll be talking about the BMP program for Muni as well, the non-per capita conservation program. Excuse me. So we hope that I know many of you participate in multiple of these. As I said, all of this meeting information is available both on the management plans work group or the 5MP page of our website, and it's all available on ADWR's public meetings calendar, including the slides and videos and login information and all that good stuff. All of our meetings are going to be fully online until further notice. We're still kind of working on a transition plan for when exactly it is that we'll start having public in-person meetings again. But even once we do start having in-person meetings, we do anticipate that the online forum is going to be a substantial portion of these meetings for some time. So we do want to thank you all for the time and the effort. We know that it takes to log into these things. We appreciate everybody's feedback and participation throughout this. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we really would like feedback on kind of our meeting management and our strategies around holding these meetings. If there are better ways that we can do it, we would love to have those ideas. We're trying to make these as participatory as possible, but I know it can be a little bit challenging in these types of forums. So we do very much appreciate all of your time and the effort that goes into participating in these meetings. So with that, we can go to the next slide. Are there any final questions before we wrap up today?
Thank you, Natalie. I'm not seeing any questions or comments coming through at this time.
Great. Well, I appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here, for your feedback, for your participation. I would absolutely, I know sometimes it's a little bit hard to get your questions in the chat box, that type of thing. I would absolutely encourage you to reach out to me, reach out to our management plans email that you see on the screen. We would love to hear any thoughts or ideas that you might have, or help you with any questions that you might have. We are always looking for additional feedback. We're wanting this process to be collaborative. So we are definitely looking for any thoughts or additional. So with that, we can go ahead and close. Thank you again for your time and participation today. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you.